Hello everyone. This episode is a little bit different to usual. The main source I used was a book written by the perpetrator and the victim. So the level of detail we have is really interesting. I'd really like to know what you think of this case, if you like things like this that are much more detailed, or if you prefer the sort of shorter 20-minute episodes. Please let me know in the comment box down below. Other than that, let's get to it. Linda was in her house when she heard the words "package for Linda Riss," accompanied by a knock at her front door. And so Linda ran towards the door, sure that this gift would be from her new fiancé, Larry. She opened the door a crack, peering outside to see who was on the other side, but she didn't recognise the man. However, as soon as she had opened that door just a tiny bit, the man on the other side pushed it open as wide as he could, and he threw something in her face. Linda felt this kind of wet substance on her face, but it quickly morphed into a burning sensation that felt as though it was melting through her eyes and face. She screamed out in agony, but the man was long gone, and next to her stood her mother, writhing in pain. She had also been splashed with the clear, deadly liquid. This is Red Rum. Stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents. And so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box below. Linda Riss was extremely close to her mother Bertha, who she had grown up with through her childhood years and into her adult years. Linda had a passion for art and she graduated college with an art degree, but she found it hard to gain employment in the field of art, and so she just ended up sort of bouncing from job to job, finding them quite unfulfilling, until eventually she settled at Sinrod Services. And then one day a man approached Linda from across the room. This man, Bert Pugash, he seemed totally taken with Linda. He was mesmerised by her, and so was she by him. She described speaking to him and thinking he was the brightest man she'd ever met. After he left her that night, he looked up her address in the Bronx phone book and he called a florist. He ordered a dozen roses to be sent to her house. And then the next day, the pair went on a date, and Bert, determined not to let the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen get away, made sure to try and impress her with, in his words, the things he'd achieved and the things that he already possessed. After 4 dates, Bertha, the ever-protective mother, started to grow a little bit suspicious of Bert. Given his lifestyle, she suspected that he might be married. She said to her daughter that there was no way that this man with 2 cars and an amazing job and a house would be single. He must be married. But Linda hadn't ever thought of this, and when she confronted Bert, she was incredibly surprised to find out that yes, he was in fact married, but he assured her that he was in the process of getting a divorce. Just the following week, the pair met up again, and Bert actually brought his divorce decree to this meetup to show Linda the paperwork. But Linda was suspicious. She'd pretty much always been suspicious of men. She'd never really trusted them. And so she made a note of the divorce decree number and said that she was going to check it out for sure. In the meantime, the pair continued to date, with this relationship blossoming and becoming more and more intense, and unfortunately also obsessive. Bert would later speak about wanting to possess Linda, and at this point in their relationship, he stated the need to have sex with her. But Linda told Bert she hadn't had sex with anyone and she wanted to wait until she was married. And Bert told her that he wasn't believing this. He refused to believe what she was telling him. He said he had it on good authority from a number of his friends that Linda had slept with a number of different people. And he said he knew the reason she wasn't sleeping with him. It was because he wasn't very good looking. This is something that he obviously had an insecurity about, and to be fair to him, which I don't necessarily feel like I need to be fair to him, but in this case, Linda did actually speak of the fact that she didn't even really find him attractive, but she was attracted to his personality, to his charm, to his wit. It wasn't his looks that had brought her into this relationship. But Bert was obsessed with getting Linda to sleep with him, and firstly, he tried to manipulate her into doing this by just attempting to persuade her. But when that didn't work, he decided he was going to try and get her drunk, really drunk, so that he could, well, this is what the book says, and in his words, take advantage of her, but let's call it what it is. He wanted to rape her. This woman that he's supposedly in love with, wants to be with for the rest of his life, wants to eventually marry and have children with, he outwardly says that he wants to take advantage of her when she's drunk. He wants to rape her. But Bert soon realised that this was never going to work because Linda just never allowed herself to drink to the point of getting drunk. And that is when Bert called a doctor friend of his, and he managed to get some prescription pills, some knockout pills. And so one night after the pair had been out drinking, he and Linda were at her flat and he dropped one of these pills in Linda's drink. After she'd finished her drink, he attempted to take off her robe, but she slapped him away, protesting, saying that she'd already told him she didn't want to do that and told him to go home. And as she said this, he looked over to her empty glass, or almost empty glass, and he saw at the bottom sat the pill that it was a capsule, but it hadn't actually dissolved into the drink. And so she hadn't ingested any of that prescription pill. That's why she was fully conscious. That's why he hadn't been able to rape her. And then it was around Christmas time when Linda's mother, Bertha, pulled her to the side. They were in their sort of living room. They were still living together at this point. And she pulled her to the side and she said to her that she had some really bad news. She was right not to trust Bert in terms of his divorce. She had had that number checked on the divorce decree and it had come back as being false. It turns out Bert had got his secretary at work to make this false document that said that a divorce was in the works. Linda immediately confronted Bert about this, but he just said that the divorce was in the works, it just wasn't finalised yet. He said he just needed some time, but Linda wasn't interested in this. She said that if he ever got the divorce, he could call her, but until then, she didn't want to speak to him anymore. This, unfortunately, though, didn't last for very long, with Bert coming back into Linda's life and eventually convincing her that this divorce really was in the works. He even showed her the place he was staying. He was staying at a friend's house and he'd been staying there for some time, so he said. Bert even made his own dad go round to Linda's house where she was living with her mum and convinced them both that this divorce really was happening. It was just taking some time. And so the relationship resumed. And this went on for a long time. Things were constantly on again, off again. It was really back and forth. It basically was Bert convincing Linda that this divorce would actually happen. Meanwhile, Bert's wife, Francine, wasn't ever going to grant him this divorce. She was aware of the affair that had happened. She was aware of a number of affairs that Bert was having, but she'd come accustomed to this lifestyle and she didn't want to get divorced from him. Remember, this is the 1950s and divorce wasn't really a done thing. It was a big deal to get a divorce in that time. I think it's probably quite important to say here that Linda was very much in love with Bert. And even though this was all going on, she couldn't help the way that she felt. However, by the late 1950s, she really had enough of this back and forth and decided that she needed to give herself a chance at having the proper life that she'd always wanted. She wanted to get married and have children and live that life. And she knew that she just was never going to be able to do that with Bert, despite how much she loved him. And so she picked up the phone and called Larry Schwartz. Larry was someone that she had met in Miami Beach back in 1956, and they had really hit it off then, but nothing further had ever happened because of her sort of on again, off again relationship with Bert. Larry was head over heels in love with Linda from the off, and so that night he picked her up and he took her home to meet his mum and his sisters. They then drove to Manhattan and they went for dinner, they went to see a movie, and then he dropped her back at her house. Now, in comparison to Bert, Larry could not have been more opposite. He had a job working for his dad at this uniform supply business. He drove this beat-up station wagon. He was really down to earth. He didn't have a huge amount of money, but that didn't matter to Linda. She really liked Larry for who he was. He was also incredibly relaxed and had a much more calm demeanour than what Linda was used to. But, of course, and kind of unsurprisingly, Bert was still there trying to worm his way in from the sidelines. And when he learnt that Linda was seeing someone else, he was furious. he began stalking her. And it's not called stalking in the book that I read, but it absolutely is that. He would track her down wherever she was at, whether it was where she was living, or one time he tracked her down to a park that he knew that she would be at, and he told her that he needed her to take him back, but she said no, and she told him to leave her alone. Bert even said that he was ready to marry her now. He said that he would have the engagement ring ready for her tomorrow, but again, Linda said no. And this made Bert furious. He said to her if he couldn't have her, then he was going to make sure that no one else would want her. He would call her every single day. He would even get his friends and his dad to call her. He even began turning up at her work so often that Linda got in this sort of habit of asking the men that she worked with to check outside, and if Bert was there, they would let her know, and she would use the service exit so she wouldn't have to deal with him. Bert's obsessive behaviour continued, and it even got worse. One Sunday morning, he opened up an envelope and he placed 2 cigarettes inside, and they were both laced with marijuana. He addressed the envelope to Linda and he took it to a postbox near her house. The following day, the police arrived at Linda's house and they were holding this envelope with the 2 cigarettes laced with marijuana inside it. They asked who had sent it and how long she'd been using for, but of course, she didn't know anything about it. Even so, she was arrested and she was taken to the district attorney's office, where she told them she knew who had set her up. It was Bert. And she told them that he'd been harassing her since they had broken up, at this point many months ago. And the DA did call Bert and tried to get him to confess, but remember that he's an attorney and it's a small area that they live in. Everyone knows everyone, and he wouldn't admit it on the phone, and so they just dropped the case. And then one day, Bert met a sex worker who he thought might be able to help him with a plan. He asked this woman if she knew anyone that would be able to beat up a girl for him. He said that he would pay them a total of $200. And the sex worker agreed. She said yes, she knew someone and could help. And so over the next couple of weeks, a number of men were paid to follow Linda, but none of them actually ended up beating her up. They all said that they just couldn't find the right time. They couldn't find a place where they felt that they wouldn't be caught, or where someone else wasn't around who would try and stop them. It was after this that Bert turned up at Linda's workplace again. Bearing in mind the things he's doing behind her back, he then produces a huge engagement ring and asks her once again to marry him. And once again, she told him no. She didn't want to marry him and she did not love him. And this sent him into a jealous rage where he went away, he got blackout drunk, and he ended up beating up a stranger. After he'd been pulled off of this stranger, he then ran at a nearby window, shouting that he didn't want to be alive anymore, and tried to throw himself out of that window. Bert was pulled back and he was eventually taken to a psychiatric hospital, but he actually didn't end up staying there for very long at all. He threatened to sue the doctors and the other staff before practically forcing his way out. His wife, they're still married, his wife Francine actually came to collect him, and she was holding her keys in her hand, and Bert ran up towards her, grabbed the keys, ran out of the facility, got in the car, and then just sped off. And after that, when Bert had a little bit of time to himself, his thoughts quickly turned back towards hurting Linda. And a thought popped into his head. He had seen this article a few years earlier about this man who had had acid thrown in his face, and it had disfigured him and blinded him. And so now that was his plan. He was going to keep his promise to Linda. If he couldn't have her, then he would, in his words, make sure that no one else would want her. What's probably really important to understand at this point is that although Linda is being incredibly clear and definite about not wanting Bert in her life and wanting him to leave her alone, she does still very much love him. Now, she doesn't admit this to him, but she does admit it to family and friends. This is the man who she saw that she was going to marry and that she was going to have kids with. And this is even harder for her because right now he is offering her all of those things. He's offering her marriage. He's even trying to give her an engagement ring. But at the same time, she knows what he's doing is wrong, and she knows that she could never, ever trust him. But even beyond this, he keeps pushing. And one day in 1959, Linda does agree to meet up with Bert. Now, at this time, she's agreeing to meet up with him because he keeps coming to her work and she's worried that she's going to get fired by her boss. So she says that she will meet him at a local bar. And so after work, Linda walks into this bar just around the corner from her workplace. And she clocks Bert already there. He's clearly already had a couple of drinks. He's got a scotch in his hand. And she looks at him, she sits down, she says she doesn't want to drink and she's not going to stay for long. And so Bert got straight to the point. He said he was going to give her 3 options. The first option was that she could marry him. Of course, he's asked her dozens of times before. So now, when she's really angry with him and not even in a relationship with him, he thinks it's a great idea to present this as option 1. The second choice was that she would go to bed with him for one night and he would never bother her again. First off, I'm sure that he absolutely would bother her again. Also, the charm, the romance on this guy is through the roof. Just have sex with her once, please, and then he'll leave her alone. And the final choice, if she refuses any of those 2 sparkly, tempting offers, then he would do what he had threatened to do to her. He would make sure that acid was thrown in her face and no one would want to date her. And of course, this terrified Linda. She knew Bert and she knew that he was serious about this. She told him she needed to think about it, but realistically, she just wanted to get out of the bar and as far away from Bert as she possibly could. Bert then called her 3 days later and asked her what choice she'd made, and she told him clearly and definitely that she was not going to marry him. She also informed him she wasn't going to sleep with him, and he told her that that meant she had made the 3rd choice. And Linda said that although she was, quote, very, very afraid of him, she just didn't think he would actually go through with this. Not because she had any faith in him making the right decision or being a good man, but because she knew that if he did do this, it would ruin his law career, he would be disbarred, and she just didn't think that that was worth the risk for him. And then the harassment amped up even more. Linda was asleep at home one night when she got a phone call. She picked up the phone, and on the other end was a man's voice who she didn't recognise, and all he said was, quote, "I'm gonna get you." And then he hung up and Linda was left standing there in her night clothes feeling incredibly vulnerable, just wondering who Bert had hired to make this phone call. And if he was able to do this, what else was he capable of? And this wasn't just a one-time thing. This happened over and over again for weeks and months, with men calling the house at all hours of the night, repeating that same phrase, "I'm gonna get you." There wasn't a whole lot that she could do. These phone calls lasted a matter of seconds. So even if she could get the police on standby, there was no way that they would ever be able to trace the calls because they were so short. But then, one day when Linda was at work, she got a call from a woman. It was the sex worker who Bert had asked to find someone to beat her up. Now, this woman identified herself and she revealed what Bert had wanted to happen to Linda. This woman said that she agreed to Bert's face, but she was never actually going to get someone to beat Linda up. She just wanted to keep the money. Now, as this conversation was going on, whilst Linda was on the phone, she scribbled on a piece of paper and she gave it to her colleague. And on that piece of paper, it said, "Have the police trace this call." And in order to trace this call, she had to keep this woman on the phone for over 2 hours. The police did eventually get a trace, but they said that they couldn't arrest Bert because Bert hadn't been the one to call. He hadn't been the one that was threatening her or saying that he was going to do anything to her. The real culprit was Bert, and she wanted him arrested. He was absolutely terrifying to her. He was stalking her. He was paying people to beat her up. He was threatening her with acid attacks. But the police said the most they could do was arrest the woman who had called Linda. They couldn't do anything about Bert. And so after that, Linda asked her work colleagues that there would always be someone to walk her home, to walk her back to her car, so that she was never alone. She knew that if Bert found her alone, there was no telling what he would do. Linda even went to court and took a summons out against Bert for harassment. But the court clerk wasn't able to actually locate Bert, and so the summons expired. She knew that the reason they weren't pursuing Bert was because he was an attorney and they saw her as a, quote, nobody. She said they refused to believe that he could possibly do anything wrong. And this is a freaking horrific. And this is what Bert admits in his own words. So we know this to be true. It was in March of that year that Bert hired a corrupt police officer to help him abduct Linda. And his plan was that he would abduct Linda, rape her, get her pregnant, so that in his words, she would have to marry him. He paid this officer $200. Now, thankfully, though, Linda was too scared to stay at home. And so she had actually been spending time between different people's houses, sometimes spending weeks away from her own apartment. And so that plan didn't go ahead, despite Bert and the officer actually waiting outside of Linda's house for 3 nights. And then one night, Linda and her new boyfriend at the time, Larry Schwartz, they had been dating for a little bit of time. They were in her living room, curled up on the sofa, when they heard a huge crash. And they looked over and the window was completely shattered. And on the floor lay a brass door handle. Someone had thrown it through the window. Now, thankfully, neither of them were injured. This door handle had gone just past them. They were just a little bit too far away from it where it had landed. Linda immediately called the police. She told them that she was too afraid to go out alone and that her life was in danger. She begged them to protect her. She told them this was all Bert's doing. She gave them his name and his address, but they said unless she had seen him specifically do this, throw that brass handle through the window, then they, quote, couldn't do anything until something happens to you. And one officer even told her that if Bert wasn't a lawyer, then they maybe would look into it more. But Bert knew the law, and so they just weren't going to pursue it. The next day, Linda answered the phone at work, and a voice spoke to her, quote, "Next time we won't miss." Of course, this was incredibly traumatic for her, and she began crying. And her boss came over and he said to her that he was sorry, but if she didn't, quote, pull herself together, then he was going to have to fire her. He said she was constantly distracted these days and he needed someone who could work. This case is unbelievable, man. In June, Linda's boyfriend Larry proposed to her and she accepted. The pair were due to be married and they sent out an announcement of their engagement to the local newspaper. Bert, of course, saw this and he had an absolute meltdown. This led to him getting a gun and waiting for hours outside of Linda's house. And his plan was to kill Linda and then himself. And he said that if Larry got in the way, then he would kill him too. But he said the only thing that stopped him was that when they arrived home, his mind went to an image of him strapped into the electric chair if he didn't have the guts to kill himself. And so that's what made him stop right there and not commit this crime. Nothing to do with them or their lives. It was the fact that he didn't want to face the electric chair. After that, he decided that damaging Linda's face permanently and blinding her would be enough for him. He met with a man who he asked to permanently mess up Linda's face, but he specified that acid would work in this situation. He thought about it a lot. And then the man looked at him and he replied that if he wanted to blind her, then lie would be best. They haggled the price down between them, going from $5,000 to $1,000 and then eventually settling on $2,000. And by this point, Linda had changed jobs. She had gone where she assumed Bert would never know where she was going to be at, so she did feel a lot safer. What she didn't know was that Bert had hired a private investigator to find out where she worked, and so he had that address. He knew exactly where she was going to be. He pulled up right outside her work and sat in the car with the man he had hired right next to him, and they'd already stopped at a grocery store and they bought lye and club soda, which would be mixed together, and at the right time they would set off this chemical reaction and it would turn into this sort of acid that would be devastating if it was put onto Linda's face. But Bert still needed to identify Linda to this man so that he could come out of the car and attack her. And so when Linda came out of the office, he squinted to really make sure it was her. But before he got the chance to point her out, she quickly checked over her shoulder and then checked over the other shoulder and then darted through the sea of people and into a doorway and hid there. The 5 p.m. rush of commuters there were so many of them that he just couldn't find her again. She was clearly conscious that Bert might be around somewhere. He may well be stalking her at any given moment. And of course, she was right. Even though she didn't think that Bert knew where she worked, she was still conscious that he could have done exactly what he did and track her down. But within this, the man had managed to see sort of what Linda looked like. So although he wasn't able to do the attack there and then, she had been identified, and so he agreed that he would get it done in the next couple of days. It was 8 a.m. on a Monday in mid-June when Linda heard a knock on her door. She was getting ready for work, and so her mum, who she was still living with at this time, called out asking who was there. And the reply came that there was a package for Linda Riss. Bertha attempted to send the delivery man away, saying that it must be from Bert and they didn't want to accept it. But Linda shouted to wait. She hurried out of her bedroom and she said to her mum that it probably wasn't from Bert, it may well be from her new fiancé, Larry. And so she opened that door a crack, and as she did, she peered out to see who was on the other side of the door, and the man pushed the door so it opened more and then threw this liquid in Linda's face. And that sensation of wet on her face quickly morphed into this burning that intensified as it got into her eyes. And her mum was next to her and she had also been splashed with this liquid. And so they're both screaming, they both run to the bathroom and they splash cold water over their wounds. And there's obviously a huge amount of noise coming from the apartment and the neighbours hear this happening, and so they call for an ambulance. They were both rushed to hospital, and Bertha had minor wounds, but Linda's were quite drastic. It was determined that she had lost sight in one of her eyes, and the other eye had lost about 80% of the sight. Linda lay in the hospital bed unconscious with this greasy lotion of medications all over her eyes and face, and these scars were already forming and they were really deep. They were on her eyes, on her forehead and on her cheeks. Now, of course, there's no question who's done this, and so the police go to Bert and they question him straight away, but of course he pleads his innocence, at first saying that he couldn't have done it, he wasn't around. But it didn't matter, because the man who he'd hired to do the crime wasn't keeping quiet. It wasn't long before Bert started receiving threats. One day, his secretary came up to him and said that a man had dropped off this envelope for him. She gave him the envelope, and as he opened it up inside, there was a note that said that Bert needed to leave $3,000 in a telephone box on Lenox Avenue. It said if he didn't leave this amount, then the same thing that happened to his girlfriend would happen to him. Now, Bert didn't pay that first time, but the blackmail did continue. Meanwhile, Linda is back at the hospital, and the next few weeks and months are her focused on recovery. And unfortunately, Bert's threat to her that she would be disfigured in a way that no one would want her, unfortunately came true in terms of her relationship with Larry. Larry met another woman and eventually abandoned her while she was still in hospital. He really showed his true colours. Linda was eventually discharged from hospital and she went to a new home where Bert wouldn't be able to find her. The police also had no choice but to really take this seriously now, and so they placed a detective right outside her house for round-the-clock protection. Now, the police have zoned in on Bert, and although he has denied that he was ever there and that he did this attack or hired anyone for this attack on Linda, they do suspect him. They sort of know at this point that it has to be him, but they need to get the evidence. They managed to tap into Bert's office phone and they managed to bug his whole office, but Bert was careful not to ever incriminate himself whilst he was there. And it was around 4.5 months after the attack that Bert hired another private investigator to track down Linda's new home address and to get her phone number. When he got that information, he picked the phone up and called her. He called this woman who he has literally just blinded a few months ago. He pleaded with Linda, saying that she must know he would never do anything like this to her and that he still wanted to marry her. And Linda replied in a way that surprised even Bert. She said that she would marry him, but there was one condition. He had to admit to what he'd done and tell her who had thrown the lie in her face. Police wouldn't want him, she said. They just wanted to know who had actually done this. And Bert said he did have this information, but he couldn't tell her over the phone. And then he makes a few jokes and signs off the call by saying that he loves her. Now, Linda hung up, and of course, Bert didn't know this, but Linda was just doing what she'd been coached to do by the police. It was the following day that police informed Linda that they had managed to gain confessions from a man they'd arrested who they believed had actually attacked Linda. And they'd also arrested 2 other conspirators who put Bert in touch with this man. They told her they were also just about to arrest Bert for that crime. Bert's bail was set super high. It was $105,000, which at the time was the highest bail that had ever been set in that state. And this is back in 1959, so that is a lot of money. But Bert is super rich, and so he actually was able to pay this money eventually and get let out on bail. And he continued to contact Linda, even sending her flowers. But the judge found out, and he put this restriction saying that Bert wasn't allowed to contact Linda or go near her, or he'd have his bail revoked. But Bert went one step further than that. He was speaking to a lawyer who he then told that he was going to have Linda killed if she didn't agree to marry him. And of course, this lawyer then just reported this to the authorities, and his bail was revoked and he was brought into prison. The trial went ahead and it lasted over 14 weeks, which was the longest trial that had ever happened in state at that time. And Bert was found guilty on 7 charges. During Bert's prison sentence, Linda tried to get on with her life. She was working through recovery, both physically and of course mentally. She was in and out of hospital constantly and her eyesight was deteriorating day by day. She also had a real fear of making any kind of romantic commitment to anyone. She went on a few dates, but she met some proper twats. One man she dated, she only ever saw him when she was in her dark glasses and she used them to hide her eyes and the bulk of her scarring. He popped in to see her one day at work unexpectedly. She saw him from across the room and she got up the courage, in her words, to actually take the glasses off and look at the man in the face in her true form, in her true self. And the man looked at her and he was shocked. He ghosted her. He told her that he actually couldn't see her today. He'd come to pick her up for a date, but after he saw her, he said he realised something had come up and he couldn't see her at that time, but he would call her, which he actually never did. He completely ghosted her. And this, on top of a number of other unsuccessful dates, led Linda into a place where she just found it harder and harder to trust men. In 1970, Bert was denied parole. And during this time, he's still behind prison walls, but he actually manages to call Linda. He seeks help from an attorney he knows, and the attorney actually encourages him, telling Bert that he had every chance of winning her over again and that he should call her and keep calling her until she answers. Linda was furious, telling Bert that he was the cause of what she was today. But he wasn't going to give up. He got numerous other people to call Linda and try and get her to speak to him, but of course she refused. She immediately called the DA's office and she complained, and she even changed her phone number a number of times, but he still managed to track her down every single time. He also started sending her letters, and so she sent a complaint to the governor, to the mayor, to the police commissioner, to the congressman, and to the senator, saying that she feared for her life and she didn't understand how this man who was behind bars for harassing and assaulting her, she didn't understand how he was able to contact her still. But Bert continued to contact her. He wrote to her letter after letter after letter. This is confusing to me because of the crime that he committed, the fact that he was in prison for what he did to Linda. I'd have thought that he would never be allowed to contact her, but the more research I did into this case, I found an article from 2021 that said that police were only just beginning to sort of share information with prisons to prevent abusers from contacting victims. Even now that that's happening, it's by no means a foolproof method and it's not being rolled out everywhere. And that information I found was from the UK, so I'm sure it's very different in the US. But I suppose the important point is that even now in 2024, although some prisons do this, there isn't a sort of standardized, complete way of stopping prisoners from contacting victims from prison. Things got so bad, and with absolutely no support from the bodies that she had contacted, Linda felt that she really had no choice. She began considering 2 options, and these are in her words. She said she would either kill herself or she would have to find someone that would kill Bert when he got out of prison, because if he got out, she'd be, quote, done for. Bert had another parole hearing in 1974, and in this parole hearing he told them that what had happened to Linda was his responsibility and that he wanted to help her in any way that he could. They asked if he would still be willing to marry her, and he said that yes, it would be one of the happiest days of his life, and so they let him go. He was released in March 1974 after serving just 14 years behind bars. This case was huge, and so as soon as Burt was out of prison, the media was all over him. He granted a Channel 11 news interviewer some time with him, and the interviewer had actually already contacted Linda's mum and asked if she would be up for doing a kind of on-air interview with Burt there as well, speaking to Burt live. But of course she refused. However, the interview with Burt still went ahead, and in that interview, Burt was asked if he would still consider asking Linda to marry him, to which he said yes. Quote, "Linda, I love you and want more than anything else in the world to marry you." Linda saw that broadcast, but it was a complete surprise to her because the authorities hadn't let her know that Burt had been released. This is something that they had assured her they would do. She contacted the parole board and demanded some sort of protection. And that's when they issued Burt with this signed statement agreeing that he would never contact Linda ever again. Even so, he somehow managed to get an agreement passed where this was led by him. He proposed that he would give Linda money every single week because of what he had done to her. And this, it would turn out, was all part of his plan to get his disbarment overturned so that he could eventually practice law again. And this is where it becomes pretty difficult to understand. I am not qualified in any way to make any kind of assumption or judgment on why this happened. But remember that Linda grew up in the 1950s, and she's very much, when she talks about herself and about her life in her own words, she believes that her looks are all that she has. And of course, Burt has taken them away from her. But for him to still want to marry her, she thought that was more than any other man would do. She said, quote, "It's hard to admit to yourself, let alone to someone else, that you like getting all this attention from someone after a thing like this. You begin to think you're the one who's psycho. So I never admitted it, but if I didn't get a call or letter from Burt, I missed it." Linda had made sure that Burt's parole wouldn't allow any contact directly between the two of them, but she would still call her lawyer and she would ask what he'd said, how he'd been, how he'd looked. It was about 6 months after Burt's release that she decided she was ready and she wanted to meet with him. At first, she convinced herself that she was only getting back in touch with him because she needed that money that he'd promised her. He'd ruined her life. The least he could do would be to help her out financially. But she soon realised that she was just making excuses. Burt had lost his lawyer's licence and it was clear that he was never going to get that back. And in her words, that meant that he would never have any real money again. Realistically, she realised she did just want to be with him. And so Linda began to think about Burt and the fact that he was getting his life back on track. He was getting money. He was looking towards getting his lawyer's license back, although it would turn out he never was able to. And so she called him and she began speaking to him. It was a couple of months later that they agreed to meet up. And they were at a mutual friend's apartment and Burt came in, he walked straight over to her, he kissed her, and then he gave her this engagement ring and then they all went out for dinner. They were married by November of that year, so less than a year after he's been released. And the following few months were full of upset and regret for Linda. She speaks about this often in the book, but ultimately she stays with him and she was with him through the rest of her life. Burt said, quote, "When the maiming took place, it bound us together for the rest of our lives. Just as there is no way that what happened can ever be righted, there is no way that bond between us can ever be broken." Many years after the attack and in the marriage, Linda actually said that she wanted to take some responsibility for the attack that had happened to her. She said that she wasn't able to handle the lifestyle that came alongside. Burt. Just a warning, what I'm about to say is how Burt spoke about his relationship to Linda, and it really is horrific and completely unbelievable. Burt was pissed off that during his arrest and trial, not one, quote, "newspaperman, not one DA, not one judge saw that I was a deeply troubled man who deserved as much sympathy as hatred. Here I had destroyed my marriage and my whole career because of a fixation, because I couldn't survive without this girl. I loved her so much that the only solution in my berserk mind was to fix her so that no one else would want her. I would take her no matter how she looked." He also spoke about the fact that Linda had to know how much he loved her, and that he had too much to lose to do anything like, quote, this if he didn't love her. He even admits that after those 14 years in prison, when she finally agreed to marry him, it wasn't a surprise to him at all. He actually says that. It's so blindingly clear that Bert wanted to dominate every aspect of Linda's existence. He wanted to control her and totally possess her. That is what drove him, not love, as he continuously said. After the lie attack, surgery restored vision in Linda's eye to around 80% of normal in one of her eyes, but this regressed, and by the time she was 38, she had her sight had gotten so bad that she would sort of be able to watch TV, but she wouldn't be able to read, and she wouldn't be able to do much because any kind of tension caused her vision to immediately become foggy. She even began wearing this short blonde wig to try and disguise her hairline and of course her artificial eye. She was just 22 years old when the attack happened, and she died aged 75, still married to Bert all those years later, and Bert died almost 8 years after Linda passed away. I wish I had some like psychological training to try and understand a little bit more about where this fits in terms of, I don't know, Stockholm syndrome or domestic abuse, or I'm sure there's lots of things that go into it, but I don't have that training, so I'm not going to speak on it. Just know that I have a lot of thoughts, and are ultimately, I just feel really, really angry that Bert got away with this. He was only in prison for 14 years, and then afterwards he got what he had wanted that whole time. Don't like that. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Red Rum. Again, it was a little bit different, but yeah, I just found the most incredible resource for that, the most incredible book, and had to share it with you guys. Also, we have merch. I'm wearing some today. I did a little like test drop of this a few months ago. I didn't really advertise it because it sold out so quickly, which I'm so grateful for. I have some new merch back in stock. We don't have very much of it, so if you do want some, I would suggest getting on it as soon as possible. I will insert some pictures of what we have here, or if you're listening on podcast, there'll be a link in the description box down below to our Shopify. We have hoodies, we have crew neck jumpers, t-shirts, caps and tote bags, and they're all really good quality. I love them. I wear them out and about, and it's my own brand, so if I'm repping them, I hope that you'll enjoy them too. And I would love to see your pictures. If you get them, tag me on social media. I will repost them. I'd love to see you guys wearing our stuff. It would make me so happy. Other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.